Hello and welcome back, everybody. Last time we looked at the context for Luther's liturgical reforms by way of looking at the Roman Catholic Mass, both its fundamental structure and just the broadest outlines of the theology that Luther inherited as a late medieval nominalist theologian. And today we're going to talk about Luther's actual conduct of reform. Let's begin really quickly, though, with a brief review of the indulgence controversy. Luther, in 1517, encountered an indulgence preacher who was named Johann Tetzel, who was basically selling indulgences, which are a proclamation by the Pope to that allows one to remit for oneself or for someone in purgatory, or I suppose for anyone, I guess anyone who's repentant, to allow them to remit all the temporal punishments that come along with penance. And this was attached to a monetary donation to St. Peter's Basilica, but the historical details don't need to concern us here. What really needs to concern us is that the forefront of Catholic theology, as Luther understood it, and as his direct opponents, Tetzel and Johann Eck, understood it, was that indulgences operated by way of assigning a sort of heavenly credit called merit from a heavenly treasury won by the actions of both Jesus and the saints, that were then assigned to people in question who received the indulgence or had it assigned to them. And this idea of what is essentially a backdoor Pelagian works righteousness, whereby merit is acquired, in this case literally sold, by human works in a kind of automatic way, was not only the understanding of indulgences, but was also the understanding of the sacrifice of the Mass by late medieval Catholic theologians who found themselves in the nominalist camp. That is one of the great ironies of the Reformation, and you can read about this elsewhere. I have another video on nominalism, is that both Luther and his opponents largely understood Catholic theology through the lens of a philosophical system called nominalism that was condemned at the Council of Trent and doubly condemned by modern popes, starting with the late 19th century Pope Leo XIII. That's neither here nor there, really, though. What matters is that this is how Luther understood the indulgence controversy. That in turn shaped his doctrine of justification, which is almost hardens the idea of merit to where Christ's righteousness is assigned forensically to the person regardless of their interior state. In fact, it generates their interior state by way of reflection. So that the person is credited with Christ's righteousness, or justified, and that thenceforth they are regarded by God, legally speaking, as though they possess Christ's own righteousness, and that Christ on the cross in turn possessed their sinfulness, or is credited with it and accordingly, justly even punished. This theology of justification by grace alone through faith alone is then applied by Luther to the Catholic Mass. It is largely applied first and foremost in his 1520 treatise on the Babylonian captivity of the Church, in which he assigns this meritorious theology of justification as being the root cause of all that is wrong with the Church's sacramental system. And Luther, therefore, takes any sacrament that might be fundamentally a human action, like penance, or like marriage, or like the ordination of a pastor, and understands that not as a sacrament at all, but as a purely human work governed by human law. Whereas sacraments that are clearly of a gracious character, like baptism, which is a divine action, according to Luther and Catholicism, a divine action in which the human being is largely passive, or communion, and understands that to have no sacrificial character at all, purely a sacramental one. This is part of what gets him in trouble with the papacy and leads to his excommunication. The indulgence controversy already made him a sort of unwilling celebrity, but his three treatises of 1520, his Appeal to the German Nobility, his On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, and his On Christian Liberty, are really what get him excommunicated at the end of the year. One of those other treatises, On the Appeal to the German Nobility, advocated for reform of Christian worship and education by the German princes. That is, he had given up at this point on reform by the Catholic Church itself. He had previously called for the Church to hold a council to discuss his ideas, which is a really bold move. He had given up on the Pope and on bishops, and had instead called upon the German princes to seize control of the Church and then to administer reform to his liking in their various territories. This is not unlike, in fact, it directly informs what Henry VIII does in reforming Christian worship by his Privy Council in England at the foundations of Anglicanism, and then Elizabeth again a generation later. This, of course, enters Luther into the millennia-long, at least half a millennia-long debate between the role of empire and papacy in the governance of the Church that had characterized the High Middle Ages and the conflict between papal reformers of the 11th century, like Gregory VII, against Holy Roman emperors like Henry VI. And thus, I think, is really the fundamental grounds for his excommunication. Regardless, this results in a reform of worship throughout Lutheran lands that is not uniform. Unlike Anglicanism, which is really located in a single country and branches out from there, or in city reformations that take a Calvinistic character in Switzerland and France, Lutheran princedoms, whether it's the electoral princedom of Saxony or the ducal princedom of Saxony, or whether it's the Margrave of Hesse or the King of Denmark or the King of Sweden, all of these Lutheran lands conduct their reforms of the Lutheran liturgy differently. And they have really two models and two styles to draw from. The first is Luther's reform of the liturgy in 1523. He was exiled briefly to the Württemberg Castle, where he began his translation of the Bible into German, his Deutsches Bibel, and then returned to Wittenberg, where he had found a group of radical reformers like Thomas Munster reforming the Mass in an almost puritanical direction. He pulled back from that, but began reforming the Catholic Mass on his own initiative in 1523. Principally by reforming two texts. One was the offertory text, which we talked about last time, that's part of Take, and the prayers that attended the priest receiving the bread and wine on the altar. And then two, and most significantly, eliminating entirely the Roman canon. Now, that elimination of the Roman canon actually means that the part of the Mass that was most ancient, that was indeed the only spoken part of the Mass or of the Eucharistic service in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, was by Luther completely eliminated. Now, Lutherans will often say that they retain many elements of the Mass, and that's true. Medieval or early medieval, late antique chants like the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, those are retained by Lutherans. However, the most ancient portions were eliminated, and here's part of the real irony. That Luther, in trying to eliminate errors that he believed were medieval, ended up eliminating the most ancient text in the Catholic Mass. And by trying to preserve the most ancient parts, ended up preserving the parts that were in fact 4th to 8th century editions. The second stage of his reform took place in 1526. 1526, and this was his Deutschmesse, in which he set these early medieval chants to paraphrased or paraphrastic German translations that had meter and rhyme. And so this is the development of the Protestant hymn tradition, where you have chants now in the vernacular, in meter and rhyme, that are very, very beautiful hymns. But they sort of replace even these ancient chants. And these form the two options: his 1523 Formula Missae and his 1526 Deutsche Messe, one more literal, one more paraphrastic, but both lacking the fundamental consecratory prayer of the ancient church. These are the basic options that different Lutherans could adopt. And from there, they could expand to more high church or low church options. Some have more vestments and candles and incense, like in Sweden. Others are more pared down and puritanical, like in Denmark. And from there, you get the wide diversity within Lutheranism that characterizes Lutheranism and Anglicanism and really Protestantism as a whole to this day.